So now that the dust has settled, I think it's safe to say that Pokémon Scarlet and Violet clearly released in an unfinished and unoptimized state for Switch hardware, as gamers are left to explore a barren and ugly open world where apparently building interiors just don't exist, all the while encountering a slew of technical issues and bugs ranging from the hilarious to the kinda horrifying. As now in a Pokemon First, trainers themselves can evolve into unspeakable abominations and straight up no clip out of reality itself. You know, if Gamefreak lead into these glitches and created a game called Pokemon Backroom, these glitches would actually kinda slap. But clipping back into reality, all of these issues were reflected in the reviews, both amateur and professional, as it came clear that the common consensus was that Gamefreak once again failed to give the Pokemon franchise the HD, groundbreaking home console kinda Switch release it deserved, such as what Odyssey did for Mario and what Breath of the Wild did for Zelda, as this was now the 5th release wherein the legendary monster-catching RPG series continued in its mediocrity, and this time it looked as though patience had finally run out for Gamefreak, as a gaming fallout on this level hadn't been seen since the Cyberpunk 2077 debacle, where developers CDPR clearly released an unfinished game and were left to hang their heads in shame as gamers and reviewers beat the shit out of them. So would this happen for Gamefreak? Have they finally had to learn a lesson about quality assurance for their games? Oh, come on. You know what time it is. It's time to subscribe. Also, it's that time in the video where I tell you that despite all its apparent flaws, a Pokemon game went on to sell millions upon millions upon millions. And in this instance, Scarlet and Violet actually broke every single Switch selling or even Nintendo selling record, selling 10 million copies in 3 days. In comparison, God of War Ragnarok, a Game of the Year contender that released around the same time, had only managed to sell 5 million copies by the time Scarlet and Violet blasted past it with double the sales. So the sound of money pouring in must have been a bit too loud for Nintendo and Gamefreak, as initially they had the audacity to claim that they hadn't received any complaints about the game's performance or glitches, and even said there was no patch incoming, cause hey, they'd already made their money. But eventually we did get a hey, shut up, stop complaining, here you go patch, which relieved gamers of some issues. But even this is more than Pokemon fans deserve, as this is not an isolated incident of Pokemon fans rushing to give Gamefreak $60 for a subpar gaming experience. In fact, it's become quite the norm for every game that misses the mark when it comes to quality assurance, optimization to run on Switch hardware, gameplay features that fans actually want. Gamefreak has squandered this potential time and time again for what Pokemon games could actually be. And in response to this, Pokemon fans applaud and defend Gamefreak constantly, all the time. See, this is just kind of weird and depressing, because before the Switch era, Pokemon games did have some level of high quality and esteem critically. Even going from 2D to 3D, there were some issues on 3DS hardware, but X and Y and Sun and Moon were still quality RPGs, but now it looks as though these days are just behind us. As now in the modern day, Pokemon games aren't even in the conversation anymore when it comes to what are the top tier JRPGs from the modern day, as now that conversation is dominated by the likes of Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and 3, Dragon Quest XI, Persona 5, hell, even the Yakuza series have started to put out higher quality RPGs than the Pokemon series. This timeline is weird and I kinda hate it. And yet, despite Pokemon's critical fall from grace, Pokemon Sword and Shield went on to outsell all of those games. I mean, not just individually, but combined, as Pokemon Sword and Shield sits as one of the highest selling Switch games, selling almost 25 million copies. And further to that, Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl went on to sell nigh 14 million copies in the first month of its release, making it the highest selling Switch game of 2021 with just 1 month. In comparison, another highly anticipated Switch game of 2021 was Metroid Dread, and that has only managed to pass 3 million in lifetime sales. It's ridiculous. Like, these Pokemon games, they don't even have voice acting. And as this is a YouTube video where I'm ranting about the current state of Pokemon, I am contractually obligated to point out that Pokemon is one of the highest grossing media franchises of all time, and yet the games look like this and sell like that. So to get to the bottom of this, to get to why Pokemon fans act like this, we have to go back to the beginning to find out just what makes Pokemon. So the release of Pokemon Red, Blue, and Green was one of the most defining moments in video game history, as despite the limited power of the Game Boy hardware, gamers were left on a sprawling, monster-catching adventure, and even if they didn't know it yet, many gamers acquired the taste for the traditional turn-based RPG from the Pokémon series. And Gen 1 is still the highest selling entry, with over 30 million copies sold, so it's clear that Pokemon was a success from the jump. So let's break down why, starting with the titular pocket monsters themselves, as many of their designs are just downright genius. They managed to strike this fine balance between cool and cute, so that children, girls and boys would all like them. Let's take the series mascot Pikachu for example, as his cute, cuddly, yellow, mouse-like appearance is contrasted by his lightning bolt tail, his pointy ears, and his striking red cheeks, still signifying to the player that there is still an element of danger to him. And then as players would build up their Pokemon, it's likely that they would gain a unique set of Pokemon for their adventure, so it's unlikely that another player would have had the team that they did, or had quite the same battles as they had. These factors make for a somewhat personal and intimate gameplay experience, the likes of Mario and pre-Breath of the Wild Zelda couldn't give to gamers. And then this variance of player experience perfectly leads into the social aspects of the series, as due to the genius decision to make edition-specific Pokemon, this led directly into the community aspect of the series, as players would be encouraged to actually socialize amongst one another in order to trade Pokemon that they don't have. This naturally led to the development of grassroots organic Pokemon fan communities, which are still very tight-knit to this day. And then all of this was backed up by turn-based RPG gameplay. Whether or not you think that such gameplay is old-fashioned, you can't deny that it truly lowers the barrier for entry, as gamers aren't expected to rely on their reflexes and quick wits to avoid damage, so more casual players can enjoy Pokemon as they can take time to think out their strategies and aren't pressured by an incoming Goomba. And I couldn't forget this part, as beyond the game itself, if you wanted a trainer to model yourself after, there was the Pokemon anime where you could follow the adventures of Ash Ketchum. So even when players put down the Game Boy, the DS or whatever, the adventures of Pokemon didn't stop there. So after the release of Pokemon Red and Blue in the 90s, all of these factors led into a cultural consumption phenomenon like no other. It led to a phenomenon so great that it even got its own name.
Meet the latest craze to sweep the country.
Obsession with children across the...
On Beckett Price Guide. Last
movie. It's Pokémania everywhere.
Pokémania. Like many people associate Pokémania with the late 90s and early 2000s, I don't blame them, but it's arguable that Pokémania never truly went away. Like, remember the release of Pokemon Go in 2016? That was a cultural event in of itself, and in the current day, That app has been downloaded nigh 700 million times, almost 10% of the world's population, and has generated nigh $7 billion in revenue. And even created its own brand of robberies, which I guess gave players that genuine Team Rocket experience, except with less funny talking cats and more being held at gunpoint. So then, with each generation of Pokemon, this creates a new batch of fans which identify strongly with the franchise and associated with the most precious memories of their childhood, and so a brand loyalist, Pokémaniac, is born. And these are the Pokemon fans that live and breathe to consume more Pokemon products. They don't care about the quality of the games or anything else. As long as they can consume more Pokemon, they're satisfied. These are the Pokemon fans that aren't even fans of video games. These are the Pokemon fans that will buy anything with Gamefreak's print on it. These are the Pokemon fans that ruined Pokemon's potential. So firstly, let me clarify by explaining what I mean by saying that they aren't video game fans, as clearly they are fans of a video game, but aren't aware of the factors that go into making a quality gaming experience and are oblivious as to why modern Pokemon games lack in these facilities. I mean, how else can you look at other gorgeous Switch titles like Breath of the Wild, Astral Chain, Odyssey, Xenoblade, and then look at the ugly textured worlds of these modern Pokemon games and be like, yeah, this is fine, this is fire, this is heat. These games visually don't look much better than Pokemon Colosseum that released nigh 20 years ago, and they have worse animations than Pokemon Stadium, which released over 20 years ago. I know that graphics aren't everything, but even taking that aside, these games truly lack in the way of art direction, and it's very jarring, as I'll admit that in Scarlet and Violet some of the models are actually quite well textured and detailed, but then they clash so hard with the less polished areas of the game. And it's with proper art direction that games can attain a somewhat of a timeless quality despite the lack of graphical fidelity. This goes all the way back to the sprite-based era of games such as Tales of Fantasia. Even the first Kirby game still looks good. Going into later generations such as Wind Waker, Metroid Prime, Suikoden 2, Soul Calibur 2, and so on. A particularly glaring example of this, and one that I have a huge issue with, is Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. That game triggers me, as initially Pokemon fans just didn't understand why people had an issue with these chibi models, and it wasn't just the fact that they were chibi models, it was the way that they were modeled themselves. I found a great Twitter thread that went into this. It was partially due to the proportions of the models, and the angle of the camera just made the characters in the overworld much less impressive. These Pokémaniacs, they seem to try and pretend that Gamefreak didn't set a standard wherein remakes would be on the same graphical level as the mainline Pokemon games that they released alongside of. I mean, even though Pokemon Sword and Shield were ugly as all hell, apparently this was too much to ask for, as BDSP looks worse than the bloody 3DS games and the models are just less expressive. And I can't believe that these Pokémaniacs had the audacity to compare the models used in Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl to those used in the Link's Awakening remakes. Just because they were both chibi, that meant they were the same, even though Link's Awakening had a very pleasant, striking art style, that of a toy box diorama, hence why the models had this plastic sheen over them, and along with the blurred edges around the edges of the overworld. Meanwhile, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were just ugly in every sense of the word, and didn't even have platinum content. I mean, come on Gamefreak, it's too much. And then it's as though that the quality of the product isn't even a factor to these Pokémaniacs as to whether a Pokemon game is good or not, because a very common defense for BDSP was that this is what Pokemon fans asked for, with quality not even being part of the equation as to whether or not it would be acceptable. It's like, imagine if I went to McDonald's, ordered a cheeseburger, they handed me this, And I just thought to myself, well, I guess I asked for a burger. It's a burger. I ate it, got Super Saiyan diarrhea, and then just fucking died. I guess I got what I asked for. It was a burger. I guess I can't really. Oh yeah, and then another thing about the lack of platinum content. I even remember a common defense of this was that if there was platinum content, the remake wouldn't have been as faithful, and being faithful was what the remake was all about. I mean, like, and then so much of the criticism was deflected back to ILCA, like, oh, it's because it was ILCA, not Gamefreak, even though Gamefreak would have had to have approved of and given instructions to ILCA. And now, even look at what ILCA are working on currently. One Piece Odyssey, a quite decent looking JRPG. Like, I know there's a difference between the power of the systems that they're running on, but let's not pretend that Dragon Quest XI on PS4 and Switch looked radically different. I mean, even Dragon Quest on 3DS looks better than Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. Yeah, there's a 3DS Dragon Quest XI port. I didn't know either. So a common theme that I've noticed is that these Pokémaniacs seem to think that any criticism is inherently toxic, and that these billion-dollar corporations need to be babied and that they're friends with them. Like, remember that fucking embarrassing #thanks Gamefreak? During the whole Pokemon Sword and Shield quality animations debacle, where it had turned out that Gamefreak had basically lied about the reason why the national dex was cut, and that the animations were recycled from the 3DS games, and that the wild area ran at like 12 FPS. Like, the game in general ran like unoptimized garbage, looked like it with those classic Nintendo 64 trees. I love those memes. And it was clearly, to me, it's just me spitballing here, but it was clearly just an upscaled 3DS project. Like, I refuse to believe otherwise, because what the hell was that? And then in Pokemon's grand debut into HD home console territory, no voice acting. You want your Pokemon to follow alongside you, a feature that's been present for free in older Pokemon titles? Oh, you better pay extra for that DLC. Okay, we'll put it in BDSP for free, but you'll see Rayquaza follow you around like a garden stake Roomba. Like, the quality is just so apparently objectively poor, and yet these games sell so much. As apparently to be a real Pokemon fan, you have to eat whatever garbage Gamefreak throws at you, otherwise you're entitled, you're not a true fan, and you need to apologize and thank the multi-billion-dollar corporation that doesn't give a shit about your existence. Outside your money, of course. Even when you find out that Gamefreak lied to your face, you still must consume products. You just have to, nothing else makes sense for them. Like, this is actual genuine cultish behavior. And then another defense of Gamefreak is that, oh, Gamefreak, they have to render all of these Pokemon, like, they can't be expected not to cut corners and have animations look like this. Even though there was Ni no Kuni, a PlayStation 3 game that released in 2010, which had better graphics, better animation, and a much better visual art style than even the most modern day Pokemon games. And in that game, you had over 300 little monsters to select from that would follow you in battle and fight in real time. But apparently Pokemon making a half decent looking Pokemon game is just too much to ask for those poor little indie developers, apparently. The best that it can be, that you're going to have to lobby some criticism when it's deserved. A good example of this can be seen with Bloodstained, Ritual of the Night, where backers and critics rightfully tore into just how ugly the game looked from the trailers, and then the game's director made the absolute Chad move, starred himself in the trailer, just showing that the developers were addressing every single graphical shortcoming that was lobbied at them, and so as a result from that criticism, the game ended up looking much better. Now, a great example of this is of course Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, as in 2011, was it 2012? The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword released, and to be honest, it wasn't a bad game when it came out. I liked it enough. but it was just so handholdy and uninnovative outside of the motion controls, which were even somewhat controversial at the time. I like them, but the formula that Zelda had been following since A Link to the Past, which released 20 years before Skyward Sword, that the formula of collecting some sacred stuff, getting the Master Sword, getting some more sacred stuff, all before brutally impaling Ganon again, it had just grown old, and gamers responded to this, as the common consensus is just that the game is just too handholdy, and the game now currently stands as the lowest selling mainline Zelda game of all time. Despite having an install base of over 100 million sold, Skyward Sword sold only 3 million copies. And if Zelda fans just ate up Skyward Sword 10 million plus sales, there's a good chance that Nintendo never would have been pressured enough to create Breath of the Wild as it is. And all this fan feedback and all of the low sales made Nintendo, Aonuma and his team really rethink and reflect as to how they want to move forward with the franchise. They made it so that they actually got back in touch with the roots of what a Zelda game actually is, basing the demo for their next game on the NES Zelda. And so, with Breath of the Wild was released, which may not just be arguably the best Zelda game of all time, but arguably the greatest game ever made. So imagine, with just some criticism and some low scores and some low sales, imagine how that could make Game Freak rethink of what Pokemon is, what Pokemon could be. We could get the JRPG Pokemon masterpiece that gamers have been waiting for decades now. Oh yeah, Pokemon is 30 years old. I'm kind of old, but but anyway, we could get this. But as long as the games keep selling 10 million plus easy, they have no initiative to do such a thing. But instead, we got the half step forward. After the fallout of Sword and Shield, we got Pokémon Arceus. Or Arceus. Okay, firstly, I will give Game Freak credit where credit is due. Pokémon Arceus is indeed at least half a step forward, and it's clear that they put effort in where it wasn't strictly necessary, as these Pokémaniacs have made it clear that they would buy a piece of shit from Game Freak just so long as it had Pikachu's face branded onto it. As Game Freak offered a more immersive Pokemon experience, as Pokemon do more in the overworld than just jump you in the tall grass. Like, it's a proper expansion of what the wild area was in Sword of Shield. But even with that, this is the leap forward I think we should have got during the GameCube era of the franchise. But it's fitting because it does kind of look like a Pokemon game, with its low-res graphics, horrendous textures, pop-in frame rate drops, and then beyond that, it just looks like these gameplay features missing, like you can ride on Pokemon, but only one Pokemon for each type of transport. There are Pokemon in the overworld, but your own Pokemon can't follow you about, which is thankfully fixed in Scarlet and Violet. There are Pokemon in the overworld, but there can't be too many of them in one place, or else the system will. And they only have like 2 AI patterns really, and there is real-time combat involved in a Pokemon game, but it's a weird rolly game and you just throw balls at a Pokemon. It's something, but it's a bit weird, but it's something. It's weird. But hey, its sales cleared 10 million easy, so it's no wonder that Game Freak felt comfortable in releasing Scarlet and Violet in the state that they released it in, as they could rest assured knowing that their precious Pokémaniacs would shoot it up to 10 million plus easy, which they did in a record 3 days. So congrats Pokémaniacs, you really showed them. Okay, look, I know I've been hard on Pokemon fans, especially since the gaming part of the franchise only comprises a mere fraction of all the money and influence that the series brings in. But here's the thing, the merchandising, the anime and the games all exist in somewhat of a symbiotic relationship with each other, wherein the reception and quality of one will clearly have an effect on the other two. Say for instance, if the games weren't initially such a critical and commercial darling for Nintendo and Gamefreak, then the anime and merchandising side of the franchise wouldn't have appeared in the first place. So I think that some of these Pokemon fans don't realize the amount of influence they could have on the franchise. I watched a video from Girium Red, and he points out that the Pokemon fanbase have developed a bit of a defeatist attitude towards Gamefreak and their quality assurance with the series. But I think that if one were to have such an attitude as a fan base towards a franchise, then why even be fans of the product at all if all you think you're gonna get is gonna be disappointment? Like, these redemption stories can happen. Take Sega and Sonic Team for instance, with the release of Sonic Frontiers. After their many L's they've had with the Sonic series recently. Well, not even recently, for over a good decade now. It's been rough being a Sonic fan, but that's besides the point, because I'm not saying that Frontiers is some masterpiece, but look at the difference in fan reception from Scarlet and Violet and compare that to Frontiers. I know Frontiers isn't gonna, well, it didn't win Game of the Year, but compare Scarlet and Violet's fan score on Metacritic to Frontiers fan score. Although the actual Metacritic scores from professional reviewers are about the same, such a difference between fan reception is because fans can tell when developers are really trying to push themselves, are really trying to give fans a gaming experience that they know that they'll enjoy. They can clearly tell when time and effort has been put into a project. Even though Frontiers isn't perfect and missed the mark in some areas, don't worry, I have a video all about that coming up, but still seeing the difference can give hope to a fan base. And that just won't happen for Pokemon so long, well, I doubt that will happen for Pokemon so long as these mediocre games keep breaking records. But hey, at least I'll have my memories of playing Pokemon Red as a kid, having great adventures with my team, all the while saving over my brother's save data. Yeah, I was that younger sibling. Sorry, bro. But hey, that was a bit of a rant, that was a bit of a long one, but hey, thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed. Thanks again, stay locked into the cage, and peace out.